Tonight's speaker is Dr. Jane Lamm Carroll, a professor of history and women's studies at St. Catherine's University. She received her BA in history from the College of St. Catherine's and a PhD in history from the University of Minnesota. She teaches courses in U.S. history, women's history, the history of feminism, and the history of Euro-American colonization. Her primary area of research has been in 19th century Minnesota history, specifically relationships between Dakota women and Anglo-American men and their families. Her most recent book, Daybreak Woman, An Anglo-Dakota Life, published in 2020 by the Minnesota Historical Society, won the 2022 Leadership in History Award from the American Association of State and Local History, and was a finalist for the 2021 Minnesota Book Awards. I like to read a book review from the journal Choice, which all of their book reviews are recommendations. But it's a highly respected resource. The book remarkably winnows obscure local sources to create an actual biography of Daybreak Woman, always engaged with her family, struggling to make a living in communities of their kind, Dakota women married to European and French-Canadian men. Daybreak Woman, a gripping American drama, is history made real, excellent for colonialization studies. Dr. Carroll has published numerous articles in the Minnesota History, including 2 articles that were influential in my campaign to have her speak to the group. She has written about many women who are related or connected to people who lived in our area whom we know more about the men, including Cloudman and his family, Lawrence Tulliver, the Pond brothers, and many others. Dr. Carroll's book, Daybreak Woman, is available. I highly recommend it. We're delighted to welcome her. Thank you.
All right, well, I'm delighted to be here. I always love to talk about my work. And what's special about tonight is I have an opportunity to talk about my research and work before I wrote the book, because I've been engaged in this work for about 20 years. And so it's fun to approach it that way. In other words, kind of look back and pull it all together for this presentation. With regard to the 2 handouts, one gives you information about how to access the articles of Minnesota history that I have written. I've given you the titles and the date, and also you can access those by going to the website. Also, there's a few other articles I've written, not related to the Dakota, but related to Native American history in Minnesota that you might be interested in looking at too. The handout on the yellow sheet, I thought it would be easier to give you something in hand. There are a lot of names here and it gets confusing. It just gives you some of the genealogy from the various families that I've done research on, and in particular, Cloudman's daughters, because of the proximity of Cloudman's village here on Bedemakaska. I thought this would be of interest to this group to have this kind of information. That you can get a lot more detail, obviously, if you go to the articles and read the articles themselves. So here's my presentation agenda for the night. Minnesota Makoche, I want to talk about the Dakota homeland. I want to frame for you my research and my interpretation, frame it in historiographical terms, present a timeline. I'm going to then move on and talk about the Anglo-Dakota daughters and families that I've researched and which I wrote about in the 3 Minnesota history articles. I'll spend a little time talking about Cloudman's village and the Lake Harriet mission because, of local interest, obviously. We're very close to where the Lake Harriet mission used to be. And then I'll move on to talk about Daybreak Woman and the book and leave some time for question and answers. So I'll try not to talk too much. how much time do I have?
3 hours.
No. Okay, yeah, you just let me know when I need to stop talking and open it up to question. I want to start with a land acknowledgement and an acknowledgement of where we are in place. And we are in Minnesota Makoche, the Dakota homeland. The Dakota homeland comprises most of what is now the state of Minnesota, the northern part of Iowa, western Wisconsin, and west into the Dakotas past the Missouri River. Here, the Dakota have lived for unknown generations since their creation. Minnesota Makoche, the land where the waters are so clear they reflect the clouds, is their place of origin. For the Dakota, this homeland and its natural resources are gifts, manifestations of the great mystery. The Dakota people and culture are inexorably embedded in Minnesota Makoche. Their history, their stories, values, and spiritual beliefs are enshrined in specific places in their homeland. So you can see on this map the extent, and these boundaries are a little bit fluid, but generally speaking, reaching into what is now western Wisconsin, and of course across to the Dakotas and down into what is now northern Iowa. The Dakota are the people of the 7 council fires, the Hosheti Sakowin. 7 major groups, 4 lived and live in what is now the state of Minnesota. So the 4 groups that lived in Minnesota Makoche were known as the Eastern or Santee Dakota or the Santee Sioux historically. By the late 1700s and the early 1800s, most of the Eastern or Santee Dakota were the Mdewakanton. I should say the most eastern of those 4 groups were the Mdewakanton, and they had villages along the Minnesota River near its mouth and along the Mississippi River. To the west and south of them were the Wapakut, and then farther west on the prairies and up on the upper Minnesota River were the Wahpeton and the Sisseton. Now I've tried to provide just a basic timeline, and I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but it's important, of course, always to place things in time and to kind of understanding of a basic chronology. And so we have to begin by talking about the fur trade in this region. And beginning in about the early to mid 1700s, there started to be significant social, economic, and diplomatic interactions between the most eastern bands of the Dakota and European fur traders. And most of those, the earliest fur traders were French. If you know anything about that history, the French dominated the fur trade up until the 7 Years' War in North America, also known as the French and Indian War. After that war, the British won, and the French were still here, but the British basically took over their holdings in Canada, and the British started to move into the fur trade in large numbers after 1763. The French were still dominant in terms of the laborers in the fur trade, but a lot of the major traders and the companies then became British. And then it's interesting, in doing this research, I noticed a lot of these British fur traders were Scots immigrants looking for opportunity after England had conquered Scotland. And the dominant trade, the British basically stayed dominant in the trade until the War of 1812. The Americans defeat the British in that war, and so after 1815, you see more Americans moving in. And many of the former British traders stay, but others do not. So there's no significant American presence in the region until about the 1810s, 1820s, when Fort Snelling gets built, and there's an official government outpost, and then that brings in, of course, soldiers and government officials. The major treaties which took the Santee Dakota homeland wave began in 1837 when they lost their land between the Mississippi and St. Croix rivers. The most devastating treaties were the treaties of 1851, the treaties of Mendota and Traverse de Sioux. Those are the treaties that basically took all the land west of the Mississippi River in exchange for two relatively small reservations along the upper Minnesota River. And the Treaty of 1858 reduced those two reservations to one. The U.S.-Dakota War of 1862 resulted in many Dakota being killed, executed, of course, by a mass execution at Mankato. And most of the rest of the Dakota people and Euro-Dakota people were exiled, and the treaties were revoked. But in as early as the mid-1860s and 1870s, a lot of people started coming back. So one of the things I challenged in my research is this, and I'll talk about this in a minute, this kind of assumption that all the Dakota people, or people of Dakota heritage, went away. In fact, some people never left, but people came back really quickly and reestablished communities in the ensuing decades. And many of those communities, of course, were communities near what had been traditional Santee Dakota sites, including places like Morton, Minnesota, Prairie Island, Shakopee. There were, after the war, at Mendota and Faribault, significant Dakota communities that hung on for a while as well. A lot of people did leave. That doesn't mean that they didn't come back and visit. One of the other things I really noted in my research was that wherever people wound up, they were always coming back because they stayed connected to their communities and their families that way. So there was a lot of movement between reservations, between Minnesota, Makoche, and other places. Major reservations where the Santee Dakota wound up after the war included Santee in Nebraska. A group left Santee and formed the Flandreau, South Dakota community. The Lake Traverse Sisseton Reservation was formed in the late 19th century. And then many others went to North Dakota and Canada, some living on reservations, others not. This is an interesting map, but it just shows you that the diaspora, basically, all the places that people went, but also that they were moving in between these places. All right, I'd like to provide a little bit of a framework here in terms of where my work fits in Minnesota historiography. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that term, historiography is the literature of history. So basically, it's any body of work on a particular topic or on a particular region. And so what my work does is challenge an obsolete historical narrative that ignores, simplifies, or makes erroneous assumptions and assertions about Minnesota's past regarding the Dakota, the Euro-Dakota, and women. So let me, first I want to share with you an excerpt from my introduction to Daybreak Woman, which talks about this obsolete narrative and the Dakota. So in my work about Anglo-Dakota women and their families, my fundamental aim in writing about them is to put the Dakota and Euro-Dakota people firmly at the center of the story of Minnesota's past. In the last 2 decades, Both Dakota and non-Dakota historians have worked to unearth and restore the Dakota to their rightful place in the story of the states and regions past, challenging the long-dominant historiographical narrative in which the Dakota people, their society, and their culture were largely ignored, stereotyped, misrepresented, or assumed to be irrelevant in Minnesota's story, except during the US-Dakota War of 1862. My work is part of that endeavor. The long-established historiographical paradigm that Minnesota history begins with significant Euro-American settlement, that is in the 1850s, and statehood in 1858, has masked the rich multicultural history and experiences that preceded and succeeded statehood. This now obsolete but still firmly rooted master narrative of the state's history ignores evidence showing that for over a century prior to 1858, Indigenous people and Euro-Americans interacted socially, economically, and culturally as a result of the fur trade in the region, creating vibrant and influential communities comprising people of French, British, Indigenous, and Euro-Indigenous ancestry. By 1858, Indigenous and Euro-Indigenous people still made up more than half of the region's population, yet they have either been ignored or grossly underrepresented in the dominant narrative of Minnesota's past. With regard to the Dakota, the obsolete premise is that Dakota and Euro-Dakota people, pre-statehood, post-statehood, and post-Dakota War, and throughout the 20th century for that matter, are irrelevant to the history of Minnesota. My aim in my work is to contribute to the ongoing effort to replace this premise with a more inclusive, comprehensive, and accurate story of Minnesota's past. Thank you. All right, so what about women? And again, I'll share with you a short excerpt from the introduction to Daybreak Woman. The purpose and work of women's history could be described in large part as a gigantic, never-ending reclamation project. We work like archaeologists to reclaim a place for women in the past. We do that by digging up their stories and bringing them to light, including, and I would argue most importantly, the stories of ordinary women in all their diversity. Researching and writing about 19th century Anglo-Dakota women was a daunting challenge. It has been a daunting challenge. It's like putting together a puzzle for which many of the pieces are lost, broken, misshapen, or discolored, while having no idea what the final picture should look like, and knowing it's impossible to complete. Every historical account is only an approximation of the past, and the strength of a historical interpretation generally depends on the depth and breadth of the evidence upon which it is based. Writing about women in the 19th century is especially difficult due to the sparsity of the written record. In the early to mid-19th century, many Euro-American women and most Dakota women were illiterate, although white, middle-class girls and women were increasingly being educated. Even literate women rarely wrote accounts of their own lives, and not many of them tried to preserve their writing for posterity. In addition, records left by women were less likely to be preserved by their families or others because they were deemed of less interest or importance than those left by men. Most of society considered history to be something written about only certain kinds of men and certain subjects. Until the late 20th century, most professional historians were men who shared this narrow definition of history and ignored women. Thus, women are virtually invisible in the written historical record created before the 20th century in text, sources, and historiography. Finally, only in the last 50 years have significant numbers of professional historians worked to restore women to the written record and to employ gender as a lens for interpreting the past. So that's where I stand with regard to women and the Dakota and the Euro-Dakota in history. So I got into this work over 20 years ago, and I began to do a lot of research and reading about the fur trade history. And one of the things that I noticed was most of the literature in terms of talking about Indigenous and European relationships was focused on the French, not surprisingly, because they were here, they were the first fur traders. They were, for many generations, the dominant people, and they were French men. French traders were the people entering into relationships with Indigenous women. But I knew that there were Anglo traders, and when I use the term Anglo, I mean men of British descent, whether they be British Canadian or British American, or first generation immigrants. So I began to ask questions. First of all, how did those relationships between Indigenous women and Anglo men, how were they the same or different compared to French and Indigenous relationships? Had a lot of questions from the women's point of view. Were these couples and families that persisted over time or not? What were the motivations, advantages, and circumstances that led Indigenous women, in this case, I began to focus on Dakota women, to enter these relationships or to leave them? What were the expectations on both sides regarding these marriages, which were known as à la façon du pays, which means in the fashion of the country in French? What were the roles and status of these women and their influence? I began to get really interested in cultural identity of their children in particular, and the identity of these Anglo-Dakota daughters that I began to study. I began to question, how did they identify and why? What were the factors that went into their identities? And did their Dakota identities persist over time? So I'll come back to some of my findings with regard to these Anglo-Dakota daughters. I wanted to just talk a little bit now, because we are in the vicinity here, about Cloudman's Village and the mission at Lake Harriet. If any of you have been over to Daybreak lately, you know that it's a beautiful new interpretive plaque which locates the village and talks about its importance. It was founded in 1829. The purpose of the village was that Cloudman was looking for a way to provide more food for his people, to farm on a larger scale. And so he starts the village there. In 1834, the Pond brothers come there, missionaries. They build their cabin there. In 1835, a missionary by the name of, I think his first name was Jedediah Stevens, comes and decides he's going to establish a mission at Lake Harriet, and he convinces the Ponds to help him build a house and school for this mission. It's not in existence very long, but it's interesting. There is a document that shows that Lawrence Tulliver and Henry Sibley negotiated with Stevens and about the school and what the school was supposed to be like. And the reason they did that was very purposeful. They wanted a mission school for the children, for Euro-Dakota children, because there were so many of them in the vicinity by that time. And Lawrence Tulliver, as you may or may not know, was the Indian agent. He had a daughter with one of Cloudman's daughters. And Sibley also had a daughter with a Dakota woman. The mission and school were not in existence for all that long. In 1839, Cloudman had to abandon his village due to attacks by the Ojibwe raiders, and they wind up moving mostly over to the Minnesota River, south side. The Ponds eventually also leave and move and build a house out at Oak Grove, which is in Bloomington now. You might have been out to the Pond house out there on the river. And then many of the people associated with Cloudman's village who didn't go south of the Minnesota River wound up basically living near the ponds out at Oak Grove in that vicinity. The buildings at the Lake Harriet Mission were dismantled and moved and used, I think, out at Oak Grove. I don't know, and maybe someone in the audience here does know, I've never been to ascertain exactly where those buildings were located. All right, I'm not going to talk about all these women, but I have a list here for you, obviously. These are all the Anglo-Dakota daughters who were born in the early to mid-19th century that I've encountered in my research. Not all of them, I wasn't able to find enough information about all of them to write at length about all of them. In the articles, I write about Jane Lamont, I write about Mary Tulliver, who is the daughter of the Indian agent, Lucy Prescott. I write about Helen Brown, who is actually Henry Sibley's daughter. He gave her to a family named Brown after her mother died, and they raised her, adopted her, basically. Jane Anderson, who is Daybreak Woman, was the daughter of, the granddaughter of Greg Cloudwoman I and the daughter of Greg Cloudwoman II. Mary Elizabeth Ortley, who would marry Martin McLeod and have a large family, and they lived out in Bloomington. Her father was a trader named Ortley, but I wasn't ever able to find much more information about her or about her mother. Nancy McClure, who was the daughter of, her mother was the daughter of Walking Shooting Iron, known as Winona, and her mother married an officer from the fort named McClure, and unfortunately he was transferred away. He sent money for their support, but then he was killed down in Florida. And then Margaret Culbertson and Catherine Forbes. Catherine Forbes was related to the fur trader. Margaret Culbertson, I was never able to really track down her parents. But Elizabeth Williams, who was a cousin to Jane Lamont and Nancy Eastman and Mary Tulliver, her father was some kind of official. He's later referred to as a judge in Iowa. So you can see from this list, the number, there are quite a number in this vicinity. And so almost all of these Anglo-Dakota young women lived in this vicinity as children and often well into their adulthoods. As far as names, I don't know how familiar you are with Minnesota history, but there were a number of prominent early to mid-19th century Minnesota Anglo-Dakota families and individuals. You might have heard of the name of Joseph R. Brown. Brown County was married to Susan Frenier, and they wound up, well, they were everywhere, and in fact, became very very good friends and actually related to Daybreak Woman and her family. But in the end, they wind up at the end of the 19th century in Browns Valley, Minnesota, western Minnesota. Martin McLeod, as I said, married Mary Elizabeth Ortley. They established a household in Bloomington, Minnesota. Philander Prescott and Mary Key, or Negani Wina, were established at Homestead in Minneapolis, and Jane Anderson Robertson Daybreak Woman married Andrew Robertson. He was a Scots immigrant, and they wind up in many different places, and I'll talk about that in a minute when I talk about Daybreak Woman. Hazen Morse, who was a fur trader, American fur trader from New York, was the second husband of Gray Cloud Woman II. Mary Morse was their oldest daughter. She established a big family in St. Paul. Mary Tulliver Woodbury, again, this daughter of the Indian agent, established quite a large family, lived in St. Paul for some time, and then moved to the reservation in Santee. Helen Hastings Sibley Sawyer, that should be Helen Hastings Sibley Brown Sawyer, wound up as a young adult in Wisconsin, and then Mary McClure Faribault married one of the Faribault. The Faribault, of course, you know, or should know, are a prominent French Dakota family. So with regard to my research on Anglo-Dakota daughters, and again, you know, you'll have to read the articles to get the details about this, but I came to the conclusion that in terms of identity and the development and the retention of Dakota identity and cultural affiliation, that their mothers and grandmothers were key to that. And of course, what that meant was that the longer they were with their mothers and grandmothers, they were living among their Dakota kin, and then they had very robust identities for that reason, even though many of them attended mission schools and for some periods of time lived, for example, with the Ponds, and other missionaries would take children in for periods of time. They'd live with them, teach them, and then they would leave. So there was back and forth. I was interested in how much influence and how much power basically these Anglo fathers had over their children. And really, it was only if they established permanent families with Dakota women and stayed with those families that they had any kind of influence. But even so, what their children developed was really robust identities in which most of them identified very strongly with both cultures. They were bilingual. Some of them were trilingual. French was the dominant language of the fur trade. So they spoke Dakota first, French second, and then depending on their family situation, maybe they spoke English. There was social space for people of mixed heritage to identify with both cultures, to be who they were, fully who they were, right? They didn't have to choose one or the other. In fact, as I said earlier in my excerpt from the introduction, the vast majority of people who made up the population of Minnesota, of this region, up to the mid-1850s, were either Dakota, Ojibwe, Euro-Dakota, or Euro-Ojibwe people, right? So that was the society. People of non-Indigenous heritage were very, very small minority. But what happens is that society shifts almost overnight, and you have, of course, non-Indigenous people pouring in to the territory west of the Mississippi River, and that society just undergoes a complete change. And then, of course, vestiges of that society remain on the reservations, but then the Dakota War comes in 1862, and that's destroyed. So that social space for people of mixed heritage disappears. All right, so let me segue then to talking more specifically about Daybreak Woman and Anglo-Dakota Life. And this book is a biography of Daybreak Woman, Ampawahiayewin in Dakota. Her English name was Jane Anderson Robertson. What you see here is the only portrait photograph in existence, at least that I could find, of her. This was taken when she was about 80 years old. You have the yellow sheet that talks about her genealogy, but her mother was Gray Cloud Woman II. Her mother married Thomas Anderson, who was a British-Canadian fur trader. But her grandmother was Gray Cloud Woman I, who was the daughter of Chief Wabasha, one of the daughters. He had a lot. And she married James Aird, A-I-R-D, sometimes it's spelled A-Y-R-D, who was a Scots fur trader who was stationed at Prairie du Chien. And what's interesting about her story is that her grandfather was a Scots, her father was of English heritage, came down through Canada, but she marries a Scots immigrant as well. I'm not going to read all this out, but just so you can see, one of the most interesting things about Daybreak Woman's biography is, and there are ways in which it makes her different than most of the other Anglo-Dakota women I studied, was that she lived in many different places, and she left Minnesota-Makoche for quite a period of time. So she was born in 1810 on the upper Minnesota River because that's where her father was trading. Basically, in her young childhood, she was living at trading posts or at Prairie du Chien. If you don't know where Prairie du Chien is, it's the junction of the Wisconsin and Mississippi rivers, so it's downriver quite a ways. It was a major fur trade depot for this region. She lived there, and then her father, who left after the War of 1812, and actually asked Gray Cloud Woman to come with him because he was going back up to Canada because he fought for the British in the war against the Americans and he refused to live under U.S. government. And she said no, she wouldn't leave. And that's another way in which this story is really different, because usually what happens when the men left, they either died or left, and they left behind, and they never took their Dakota wives or families with them. So this is, it was very unusual that he asked her that he wanted them to leave with him. But anyway, she said no. So the children stayed with her. He went up to Canada. And then when Daybreak Woman was about 12, he sent for her and her brother, and her mother, Gray Cloud Woman, agreed and sent them up to Canada to live with their father. And she lives with her father and her father's second family until she's about 27. They're up on Lake Huron. I'll show you a map in a minute. Various places. And then when she's 27, she had met Andrew Robertson, this Scots immigrant, who was a really interesting man, had been all over the world. He was 20 years older. And he pursued her for quite a while, and I got the impression that she kept putting him off, and then finally she agreed to marry him, but she said, I'll only marry you if you take me back to Minnesota-Makoche to find my mother. So she made that a condition of their marriage, and he said yes, and they come back. They reunite with her mother, and by this time her mother's married, Moores, has a second family. The two families are very close. They're living together on Gray Cloud Island. They wind up at Kaposia, Little Crow's village on the Mississippi River, which is across from what is now downtown St. Paul, that area. Then they move up to the Upper Sioux Reservation and then the Lower Sioux Reservation. In 1860, she and her husband has died by this point. They moved to a place called Beaver Creek, which is just 5 miles from the Redwood Agency, although there's still a number of people in her family are still working at the Redwood Agency. She and her family are taken captive by Little Crow, along with a lot of other Euro-Dakota people during the war. After the war, she and her family go to Faribault, and then eventually, at the end of the last decades of the 19th century, they're living on Lake Traverse Reservation in eastern South Dakota, or at Browns Valley, or in Beaver Falls, Minnesota, which is on the upper Minnesota River. Daybreak Woman always, her entire life, lived on a body of water. She either lived on a river or on a lake. And that is a reflection of her heritage. And what you have to keep in mind too is that the rivers and the lakes were the transportation system. They were the waterways for people and for commerce. So everything is circled and in yellow is an indicator of the various places the Daybreak Woman lived in her life. And when she married, she was at the most far eastern tip of Lake Huron you could possibly live at. And so one of the things about making it a condition of her marriage for her husband to bring her back here is that you could see that this would not have been a journey that would be easily undertaken. It would have been dangerous for a single woman. It would have been expensive. You needed money. In fact, they had to save money for a whole year. This of course, is in the 1830s. There are no steamboats yet operating, right? So you're talking about taking small boats and canoes. And there's a story about how they crossed, I think it was Lake Michigan. When they got to Lake Michigan, a terrible storm. They thought they were going to die, or she thought she was going to die, and she would never consent to go on any large body of water again. But then you come down and you come down Lake Michigan, and then you hit the river system, and there's a lot of portaging, and it's quite a journey. So there are a number of important ways that Daybreak Woman's story and experiences diverge from the other Anglo-Dakota daughters I've studied. What was really unusual was that she lived with both her parents until 1816, the end. So she was still very young, 5 or 6 years old, when her father goes back to Canada. But then she lives with her mother and her maternal grandparents, and then she gets sent away to go up. And she basically lives with her father's second family all that time. She attends mission schools on Mackinac Island. And she becomes a part of that family. But again, she always wanted to come back. She always wanted to come back. And the other thing to keep in mind about the Fur Trade Society up on Mackinac and in that region around Lake Huron is that, of course, there weren't many Dakota people up there. There were people from other, a lot of Ojibwe and people from other Great Lakes tribes, but they weren't her people. So one of the things I endeavored to do when I researched her life in this book is I went to every place that she actually lived, whether or not there was any buildings left there, right? So I really wanted to place myself as much as possible. Of course, the landscape has changed. It's not exactly the same, but anyway, I was startled when I went up to Mackinac Island to find that the Mackinac Mission School, which she attended, is still actually there. Of course, it's not a mission school. It's been a lot of different things, including a hotel, but it's been restored, and this is pretty much what it would have looked like. You might be familiar with a lot of the illustrations this Historical Society has of Dakota life, especially along the Minnesota River. This is an illustration of the village of Kaposia, where they lived, the Daybreak Woman and her family lived. Would have been the mid-1840s to the early 1850s. You might have heard recently on the news that the state is giving back the park at the Upper Sioux Agency to the Dakota. And the picture on the left is the only building remaining at the Upper Sioux Agency. So that would have been there, of course, when she was there. She and her family basically helped build that agency. And then the building on the right is at the Lower Sioux Agency or Redwood Agency. That, again, is the only existing building. I think it was a warehouse. This is the view of the Minnesota River, Minnesota Waukpa, from the site of the Yellow Medicine Agency. So this is, of course, again, the landscape has changed significantly, but this would have been the view that she would have had from where she was living at the time. This is just a map. I know it's kind of fuzzy, not easy to read, but kind of depicting the major places of conflict during the U.S.-Dakota War. And the blue dot on the map indicates where they were living. They were living in, as I said, 5 miles from the agency. And Beaver Creek was a settlement. After the Dakota Warriors attacked the agency, the first place they went was to Beaver Creek and attacked the settlement there. And Daybreak Woman and her family had the house closest to the river, and right across the river was the reservation. And their relative and good friend came over and basically warned them and took them back over the river and kept them in his house to keep them safe. They were also able to warn the white neighbors and tell them to try to get away. Some of them did, but many of them were not able to get away in time. So a lot of their neighbors there were killed in that initial attack. Daybreak Woman's, not her youngest daughter, but her second youngest daughter at the time, Sophie, is indicated here under the blue arrow. And she at the time was at the Yellow Medicine Mission School. She was living with the Williamsons, who were the missionaries up there. And if you know anything about that story, a number of people from the mission, when they heard what was happening down at Redwood, came together and basically escaped and managed to get downriver and eventually to the Fort Ridgely, to safety. The arrow points to Sophie Robertson. She was 14 years old at the time. You've probably seen this illustration of the execution of Dakota men at Mankato on December 26, 1862, the largest mass execution in the history of the United States. Daybreak Woman wound up after the war. Again, this is another way which her story diverged. She was able, because of her close relationship with Bishop Whipple, who was the Episcopalian bishop, and with the Episcopal missionaries at Redwood, they basically had her sent to Faribault, which was the seat of the Episcopal Church, and so they were protected there. There were other people who went to Faribault, other Dakota people who camped out and also had some protection from John Baptiste Faribault, who was there. And so there were also people, as I said earlier, that went to Mendota and went to, Mendota. And so there were groups, there were communities of Dakota people who managed to resist exile and escape exile. But most people were forced. After the war, they wound up in the Fort Snelling concentration camp, and then most of them were put on steamboats and sent downriver to the Crow Creek Reservation, where many, many people died. And of course, the men who weren't executed, most of them were put in prison in Davenport, Iowa. This is the sign I found as I was driving, trying to recreate exactly where she lived, because when they lived on the reservation, where they lived is no longer a town. There's a community center, and there's the old churches there, but is no longer the site of the agency. But the agency was established in 1870, and then it got moved in 1923. Jared Daniels, who was the first agent, was a very close friend of Daybreak Woman and her family. In fact, her son Thomas Robertson, wound up working closely with him at the on the reservation. This is the Brown family cabin at Browns Valley, Minnesota. If you're not familiar, there's this small little town right on the border. It's kind of the gateway town to the reservation. So you go across the border, and the Lake Traverse Sisseton Reservation is right there. And what's important about this is the cabin that the Brown family lived in. And again, this is J.R. Brown, his wife Susan Frenier. They had many children. And Daybreak Woman's 2 youngest children married into their family. Another thing I found in doing this research is that these families, the children of these families intermarried, and they all knew each other. So it was a pretty tight-knit community, and many times at different times, they were living together in the same places. So for example, if you go back to Prairie du Chien and Daybreak Woman's grandfather, they lived next door to the Faribault patriarch. I think it was Alexander was the first, right? And so then you can kind of and then of course they're connected to the Faribaults, and then you go out if you look through the cemetery out at Lake Traverse, you see the same names who were, of course, on the reservations or at Kaposia or back to Prairie du Chien. I found this, Beaver Falls is a ghost town. I didn't think anything existed. I was walking through the woods and I found the town hall, which was abandoned some time ago. Beaver Falls was a thriving town in the Minnesota River until the railroad came in the 1890s, about 20 miles to the north, and the town just completely died. The reason I care about Beaver Falls is that 2 of Daybreak Woman's children farmed there and lived there. And then later, they were going back and forth between the reservation and Beaver Falls. So most of her family lived on the reservation. This is St. Mary's Episcopal Church at the Lake Traverse Reservation. The church, this is actually the original, so this is the church that she would have attended, although it wasn't built until many years after she first went to the reservation. She was a very strong Episcopalian, and as I said, that association proved very, very important to her and her family during and after the war. In fact, Bishop Whipple kept her sons employed. They helped them rent a farm. So basically, their economic survival depended on the generosity of Whipple and Hinman, Reverend Hinman, who is the missionary. This is her gravestone in the St. Mary's Episcopal Church. I just showed you a picture of that at Lake Traverse. She was 93 years old when she died. Okay, so no more audio visuals. Yes. I hope you have time for questions.
Your research, your ability to read the handwriting, and can you imagine reading all these different handwritings?
It's challenging too, because in the 19th century, paper was expensive, so they would write this way, cursive, and then they'd turn it and write crosshatch, basically. So if they had good penmanship, that was fine. If not, it was kind of a nightmare.
And so do you read French also?
I do read French, although I wouldn't say I had to use a lot of that, but yeah.
You talked about the impact of the Anglo men if they stayed with the families. How typical was that? Was that typical or untypical?
Whether they stayed with their families?
Yes.
More of them did than I would have predicted. I can't give you a statistic, this percentage. but most of these, whether you're talking about French or Anglo, I would say because of when the French were dominant in the fur trade and active, it seemed like more of them tended to build families. But I guess the pattern that you saw a lot with British traders, but then especially more with American and then American soldiers and officials associated with the fort, was that they were very short-term marriages, and that the men did not stay with their families. Now, that doesn't mean that they weren't interested in their children. So one of the things I talk about in my articles is how the Indian agent, Major Tulliver, was very interested in his daughter and what was going on with her. But he didn't stay with her mother. And in fact, when she was being born, he was up in Virginia courting his white wife, who he would bring back with him. So as long as the mother, you know, it's interesting when you read his journal or his letters, there are things he wants to happen, but he can't make them happen because her mother and her grandmother are in the way, right? And then Sibley, too, was very interested in, you know, he did not abandon his child, but he was determined. What happens is that her mother dies young, and then that gives him the ability basically to take her, place her with an adopted white family. And she becomes almost totally acculturated to white Anglo society. She winds up marrying a doctor. They go to Wisconsin. Unfortunately, she dies really young in childbirth. That's the other thing I want to say about this research is that the mortality rate, not just as a result of dying in childbirth, but if any of you have read Daybreak Woman, the book, you'll know that so many young women died of it. What must have been tuberculosis? Must have just been rampant, especially on the reservation. I was just struck by how many young people, if you could survive the early childhood, the next threat was, I think, TB and surviving into your 20s. And then it seemed like if you could do that, then you could live a pretty long life usually.
It's amazing how long Daybreak Woman lived. I mean, considering, you know, the hardships and the times.
In fact,
of
she
economic
outlived so many. She outlived 2 of her daughters and many of her grandchildren, which was remarkable.
Yes. For those of us who are concerned with Native American indigenous people here in Minnesota, and of course all over America, if we are white, it would be wonderful if we would try to repair the great hardships and killing of people and destroying their culture. And I want to just say I grew up in Edina, and I graduated in 1960 from high school, and there was one young woman my age her name was Karen Whipple. And in our group here, we have had a woman who has done extensive research on the, what was it called? Was it redlining or the covenants? The covenants that didn't permit people of color to, have houses, for example, in Edina and throughout, Minnesota. So after I graduated from Edina back in 1960, then many years later, another friend who became an elementary school teacher, and I had a degree in elementary school teaching too, she revealed to me that Karen Whipple actually had been, part Native American. But of course, she never revealed that to me, and perhaps never revealed it to anyone in our school, because again, they were not permitted to own houses. So I was wondering, one is it Whipple, what you mentioned, Bishop Whipple? And I'm wondering if somehow either Native Americans took on his last name, or somehow people in his family later married into Native Americans. And then the last thing, just interesting related to this, is in 1960, I had the Y-Teens was a very popular group in the high school, and I decided, and I was the president of my little club, I decided to have a special event, and we were going to give the money to enable two Native American girls go to camp. And because of that, I think Karen Whipple decided to join with me in having a little play group for children in my backyard, you know. But she never told me that she was part Native American. It was another friend of ours who said that. So anyway, you know, we have this long history with the Native Americans, and so they certainly need our help. But it's Whipple.
I don't know. I don't know enough about Whipple's family and his children.
You know,
I
I've
know that-
actually thought that next year we tried, because there's a book out on Bishop Whipple, I thought we would try and maybe get somebody, and that would be a more in-depth look at.
To my knowledge, he himself did not have any relations or relationship with Dakota women or indigenous women, but
Whipple did has a connection to this church because he in the late 19th century he visited and conducted services for the Sunday school group that this church grew out of. So there's a slight connection there. But the question I wanted to ask, so how did the women and the other children that had this mixed parentage, what was their function in helping the groups get together or relate? I mean, the fact that they were bilingual would certainly help, but what about other ways? And the other thing that I was going to ask, well, you just touched on a little bit, but it appears that most of these children stayed with on the Native American side, but some of them, like you said, did become anglicized. And
you're talking about identity?
Yeah,
when you say
their
stayed?
identities and their lives.
Well, so Euro-Indigenous people had a whole spectrum of cultural identity upon which, you know, they could choose to identify, or did, you know. So depending on the situation, the time period, what you're talking about, you had people of mixed heritage who would be totally at one end of the spectrum, totally at the other, but most of them could be both until, as I said, until the 1850s. And then what happens with the Dakota War is that it becomes dangerous. It's dangerous. It's literally dangerous because there's a bounty on Dakota people. The government will pay people money to bring their scalps in. So, and because there's so much hatred and there were calls for complete genocide, people wanted the Dakota wiped out completely. Massacred. So there was so much hatred, and so one of the interesting questions for me is, you know, for the Euro-Dakota people and Dakota people who managed to stay in the state, like say in the 1860s, when that anger and threat of violence was so great, how did they negotiate that? One interesting thing about Daybreak Woman's family is that they seemed, while the Dakota who were in Faribault, who were camped together, were protected for a while, but then they started to get treated more harshly by the community. But her family seemed to be able to negotiate it pretty well. For example, her son, at one point, he shows up as the captain of the community baseball team. And what's interesting is that that son, who was a teenager, I think he was 13 or 14 when the Dakota War broke out, he is the only one of her sons, only one of her children who actually doesn't ever go to live on the reservation. He marries a young white woman and moves to Winona and lives with her family, and then, So when I look at Daybreak Woman's children, it's really interesting because her oldest sons married Dakota women. Her two youngest children married Anglo-Dakota Brown. Her oldest daughter first marries a white man on the reservation. He gets killed in the war, and then she marries Lawrence Prescott, who is Philander Prescott's Anglo-Dakota son. And then her two other children marry immigrants, one a Swede and one a Scots immigrant. So, but regardless of who they marry, except for the one son who went to Winona, the rest of them wind up on the reservation or living close to the reservation. And they remain, even when they're not on the reservation, they remain a part of that Dakota community that forms or reconstitutes itself on the reservation. So it's a really interesting question, how they identify and what their choices are. And again, that would change with time, place, circumstances.
Okay. I know that it's getting late for some of us, but I wanted to say, if we have like maybe one more question we can do, but I just wanted to share that David and I and some others went out to the new Fort Snelling at Badote, the new visitor center, which is open in the winter. I will tell you, it's heated. And it is, they've really had it was very difficult for them to try and incorporate different voices and histories compared to kind of the way it had been presented before. And I was, we only got through kind of the new indigenous part. We didn't get up to the actual fort part, but I highly recommend. They've got great interviews, people talking and sharing, and it's really really builds on kind of this program tonight. Our Tulliver was one of the biggest slaveholders in the area when he was here.
Although the evidence shows that he was very solicitous of his daughter, and he kept in touch with her even after he left Minnesota. They corresponded and was very concerned about her welfare. So I don't, he actually owned, did he own Dred Scott or did somebody else at the fort? There was a doctor at the fort who actually owned Dred Scott. Yeah. But I think it was Tulliver's Eliza, who the enslaved woman that he owned, was the one who married Dred Scott, I think, right? Yeah. So, and of course, the attitude towards Native Americans, at the time, including Tullivers, was they had to become like whites, or they weren't going to survive. And that was the whole thing about, get them to try to change their ways, because otherwise they won't survive. So.
Okay. Thank you so much.